All right, this is a brief screencast just to discuss the scientific method. There are aspects of the lab that you're doing this week that go beyond the scientific method. And originally, we had an in-lab experiment that brought the scientific method, osmosis and diffusion, all together in one activity, but we can't have you guys do that activity at home. So I've pulled apart the lab into different pieces, and you're going to have a couple different things to do. This part is just learning the scientific method. It's pretty straightforward. This is the diagram, if you will, of the scientific method that Dr. Katja put in this lab guide when he wrote it. So it would be start with observation, formulate a hypothesis, devise a testable prediction, conduct a critical experiment, draw conclusions, and then here, this is the important part, right? If your conclusions are that you're wrong, then you generally formulate a new hypothesis. If you're right, then you try and publish your data. Sometimes it's useful to try and publish negative data so that you can tell people, look, I tested drug A or approach B to solving this disease and it didn't work, so you can all save your time. That kind of data is much harder to get published, and you actually have to do more work. Like, you really have to prove that that hypothesis was really, really wrong before they will publish negative data, because they don't want to shut down people trying different methods of testing the same hypothesis. So at any rate, I'm going to skip over to this goofy little, sorry, let me get rid of that, scientific method slideshow that I stole from another book, but don't tell anybody I'm violating copyright, just to go over how it might work. So this is an example. In this example, they don't do step 6, which is publish your work, but it is the most important part of the scientific process. This is the reason why scientists trust science. It's not necessarily because we take other scientists at their word, it's because they publish their results. And if they're writing a good paper, their methods are published and are transparent enough and well written enough that other people can try and repeat their experiments. And generally what happens is, a lot of stuff gets published that may or may not be true. Sometimes it's just a statistical fluke, or maybe somebody's even lying. But that gets published. People try and build off of that work or repeat it before they try and build on what you've done or try and incorporate your work into their work. And if your conclusions don't match with their conclusions, if they can't repeat your work, people just stop citing it, and then it just sort of disappears into the trash heap of history. There aren't a lot of retractions that get printed where somebody says, we used to think this was true and now it's not anymore. Things that don't hold up to scrutiny or aren't repeatable just tend to be forgotten. But it's really the most important part, is because the idea is that you're putting your conclusions and your methods up for scrutiny. And people will scrutinize it, because proving somebody else wrong is a really good way to make a name for yourself. So moving right along, how might this work in the real world? You first start by observation or making observations, or sometimes it might be reading the literature, reading other people's work. In this case, maybe you heard from your friends that, oh man, you got to try echinacea. Like, if I feel a cold coming on, I pop like 5 or 6 echinacea every morning and it goes away within 2 or 3 days, no problem, right? That's anecdotal evidence, which is a sound basis for, what's the word I'm looking for, devising a hypothesis. It is something worth investigating. So based on what your friends who take echinacea told you, you might develop the hypothesis that echinacea reduces the duration and severity of the common cold, because this is what you heard. So why not investigate it? So now you have to generate a testable prediction. And I'm going through these slides quick because there's really more slides than you need. So you would then predict if you had a group of people that were exposed to a common cold virus, those people that were taking echinacea would either have milder symptoms or would recover quickly, or both when exposed to the common cold. So then, based on your prediction that people that take echinacea will experience shorter, milder colds, you devise an experiment to test that prediction. This particular experimental design that they came up with is a little bit more robust than just echinacea versus no echinacea. So they say, well, let's start with 4 groups of people. The first 2 groups get either a placebo, like a sugar pill, or echinacea 1 time a day at the beginning of the experiment before being exposed to the common cold. Then everybody gets exposed to the common cold, or a version of the common cold virus. This, by the way, is not something we can do with the coronavirus, because unlike the common cold, it actually kills people. Not all or many, but enough that it would be highly unethical to expose people to the coronavirus, even if they said they were willing to do it. It's the kind of risk that a good scientist would not let a study subject or participant take. Plus, we don't know what the long-term effects of a coronavirus infection are. We've seen in some people that it can do blood vessel damage and heart damage. So we're only at the beginning of all of this. We have no idea what the long-term consequences of coronavirus infection is for anybody, other than the short-term consequences of somewhere around 1% or less of the people that get it die. Sorry, so moving right along. So then, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So everybody gets exposed. Then post-exposure, those 2 groups that weren't taking echinacea get either the placebo or the echinacea. So you're testing pre-exposure echinacea versus post-exposure echinacea with a placebo control group in each. And this was actually done, and it turns out that regardless of which group you were in, placebo, echinacea, before the cold, after the cold, those people, actually I'll just go right down here. Individuals from all 4 groups are just as likely to develop a cold. The symptoms in all 4 groups were about the same, so echinacea had no side effects on the duration or the severity of the cold. So if you wanted to, you could just toss out all your echinacea now. If you really want to drill down further on this, you could maybe look at where you got your echinacea. Was it fresh? Was it old? Was it roots? Was it leaves? Were the leaves harvested in the fall or the spring or the winter? So there is more work you could do to test the echinacea before you just get rid of it. But this right here does not bode well for echinacea. And really a lot of the things that you would get in the vitamin supplement part of the store. I won't go too into detail about that. There's a lot of stuff that people waste their money on, and you should probably do a little bit of research before you spend money on mega doses of vitamin C or your St. John's wort or any other herb. It's not that none of them work, but they're just not tested as rigorously as pharmaceutical products. And even pharmaceutical products can be questionable from time to time. So imagine how questionable the herbal supplements are going to be if they're not even really tested at all, which they generally aren't. Moving right along, then I want to discuss briefly the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. Let me just move ahead. Whoops, these don't say exactly what I want them to say. But a hypothesis, as this says here, is a proposed explanation for a phenomenon. It may or may not have much data backing it up. It's usually what we would call an educated guess. So you don't just pull a hypothesis out of thin air, but it's a possible explanation for something that doesn't have a lot of data behind it yet. A theory, on the other hand, is something that starts out as a hypothesis, is generally supported by the data, and then as the years go by, the original hypothesis gets bigger and broader and develops into a theory. And I can't come up with really good examples, but like this is why we call evolution a theory, because we don't understand everything about it. Way back 200 or 150 years ago, I forget, right? Darwin came up with this hypothesis that animals evolve over time due to heritable changes in their physical traits that are then selected for or against by their environment. That hypothesis is well supported by all of the data that we have now, and we have more and more data, so now we understand how DNA is passed on from one generation to the next. We know what genes are. We understand mutation rates. We can look at the effects of sexual selection versus predation, changes in the environment versus other challenges to a population. So we know a lot more about how evolution works, what are the mechanisms that drive it, how fast does it work, all of that. So now it's become a theory because it is a much broader explanation than just populations of species change over time in response to their environment. We know a lot more about it now. So hypothesis, not well supported by the data, educated guess, narrow in scope, sort of yes-no question. And then a theory, broader in scope, has generally years of scientific consensus and research behind it, and lots of experimentation. If you're ever looking for sources, like when it comes to either a medicine or a supplement or a vitamin, and vitamins are things, let me go back to that, right? Vitamins you definitely need. There's a reason why they exist, and they interact with your body in helpful ways. It's just a matter of how much of them do you need? Do megadoses actually make you healthier? And if you eat a relatively balanced diet, do you need that vitamin C supplement at all? So if you ever want to read up on stuff, these are the two sources I recommend. They are your tax dollars at play, so they're both overseen by the National Institutes of Health, big federal government agency, again, your tax dollars. Medline Plus, as this says right here, is for the general public, so you don't have to have scientific training to go on there, put in a search term, and see if there's data about echinacea or St. John's wort, or how much vitamin D you should be taking, the benefits and pluses of anything. And then PubMed is, as it says right here, a very comprehensive database, generally for scientists and biomedical researchers. If you have a little bit of science education, you can understand some of the stuff that's in PubMed, but most of the articles there contain all of the nitty-gritty, and this is where people publish. And if you're working in the sciences, this is where you go to see what people have been working on. It's a big part of what drives scientific discourse. So I will leave that at that and just tell you that you need to know the scientific method and the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. That is all.